My name is Audrey Vance, and I'm 31 years old. The morning the police cars pulled into my parents' driveway, I was kneeling in my mother's garden, trimming the rose bushes she'd asked me to look after while she and my sister were away on a weekend trip. I remember the sound first, gravel crunching under tires, two doors slamming shut almost in unison, a radio crackling somewhere behind me. Then I heard my sister's voice, sharp and rehearsed, cutting through the quiet morning air before I'd even turned around. "She's the unstable one in this family," Brianna said to the officers, pointing a manicured finger straight at me. "You need to talk to her. She's been obsessed with our parents' money for years." I hadn't even stood up from the dirt before one of the officers asked me to set down the shears and place my hands where he could see them. My mother stood behind Brianna on the porch, arms crossed, refusing to meet my eyes. My father stayed inside, watching through the window like he couldn't bear to be part of whatever was about to happen, even though he was the one who had called them. $89,000 had vanished from the family trust account, the one my grandfather set up decades ago for emergencies and education, the one my parents had quietly been managing since he passed. 3 wire transfers over 2 months, all routed through an account that had, according to the bank statement printed and waved in front of me on that lawn, my name attached to it. I didn't recognize the account. I'd never opened it. But explaining that to 2 officers with their hands resting near their belts, while my own sister sobbed into my mother's shoulder and called me a liar, felt like trying to put out a fire with my bare hands. They cuffed me on the lawn, in front of the house I grew up in front of the rose bushes I'd been trimming for a woman who wouldn't even look at me. The metal was cold and the officer was gentle about it, almost apologetic, like he could sense something didn't add up but had a report to file regardless. As they walked me to the car, I caught one last glimpse of Brianna's face. For half a second, just half a second, the grief dropped away and something else showed through. Relief. I didn't say anything in the car. I didn't say anything when they walked me through the station, past the front desk, past the bulletin board with missing persons flyers curling at the edges, into a small gray room with a metal table bolted to the floor. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I sat down, folded my hands in front of me, and waited. People who don't know our family always assume the golden child label is a metaphor, something exaggerated for effect. It isn't. Brianna was 2 years older than me, and from the moment I can remember anything, she was the one who got the benefit of the doubt. When she dented my father's car at 16, it was because the road was wet. When I forgot to mention a B- on a report card, I was hiding something. When she borrowed $40 from my mother's purse at 14 and got caught with it in her pocket, my mother decided she must have been planning to pay it back. When I once came home 10 minutes past curfew because my bike chain snapped, I lost my phone privileges for a month. I used to think it was just bad luck, the way some siblings get more patience than others. It took me years to understand it wasn't luck at all. It was a pattern, deliberate and consistent, and once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. By the time I was 12, I'd started keeping things. Not out of any grand plan, not at first. Just a kid's instinct to protect herself, a need to have proof of what was real when the adults around her kept rewriting the story. A detective came into the interrogation room a few minutes later, a tired-looking woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a manila folder of her own under her arm. She sat across from me, introduced herself, and asked if I understood why I was there. I told her I did. She asked if I had anything to say. I thought about my sister's voice on that lawn. I thought about my mother's crossed arms and my father's face in the window. I thought about every birthday where Brianna's gifts were bigger, every argument where my side was never asked for, every quiet moment over 20 years where I watched my family choose her version of events over the truth sitting right in front of them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply looked at the detective and said the only thing that mattered. Before we go any further, I need you to call my apartment. There's a fireproof box in my closet, and inside it is a folder. I've been keeping it since I was 12 years old. I think you're going to want to see what's in it before anyone signs anything. The detective's pen paused over her notepad. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear my mother's voice rising, demanding to know what was taking so long. I sat back in the cold metal chair, and for the first time since the handcuffs closed around my wrists, I felt something close to calm. 20 years of being the one nobody believed was about to end. And it wasn't going to end with me shouting. It was going to end with paper, dates, and proof, exactly the way I'd always known it would. The detective made the call herself. 20 minutes later, an officer returned from my apartment with the fireproof box, set it on the metal table, and stepped back. The detective slid on a pair of gloves, opened it, and lifted out a thick folder, worn soft at the edges from 20 years of being hidden under floorboards, taped inside textbooks, and finally locked away once I was old enough to afford a safe. She started with the oldest pages first. A photocopy of a missing $40 from my mother's purse when I was 9, except it wasn't missing at all. It was tucked behind a photograph I'd taken on my mother's old camera, the one where you could see Brianna sliding the bills into her sock in the background, caught by accident while I was just trying to photograph our dog. A pawn shop receipt from when I was 14 for a bracelet that had supposedly been lost, but that I'd found listed for sale under a name that traced back to an account Brianna had opened with a fake birth date. Screenshots of messages, saved and printed the moment cloud backups became something a 12-year-old understood, where Brianna joked to a friend about how easy it was to get away with things in our house because they'll always believe me over her. The detective read in silence for a long time. Then she got to the recent pages, the ones I'd built over the last 2 months without telling a single person, not even my husband. Bank correspondence I'd requested the moment I noticed a strange login alert on an old account I barely used. One Brianna had apparently known the answers to my security questions for since we were teenagers. A timeline I'd built showing that all 3 wire transfers had been initiated from an IP address tied to Brianna's apartment, traceable through metadata she hadn't thought to scrub. A recorded voicemail, accidentally left on my phone weeks earlier, of Brianna telling someone on the other end that she just needed to borrow it until the inheritance cleared. Nobody would even notice. The detective closed the folder, looked up at me, and said 5 words I will never forget. "You've done my job for me." By the time my parents were allowed into the station, the story had already changed shape, though neither of them knew it yet. I watched through the small window in the door as my mother demanded answers from the front desk, as my father paced with his hands shoved into his pockets, refusing to sit. When the detective finally brought them back, she didn't bring them to see me. She brought them into a separate room, where she laid the folder open on the table and let them read it themselves. I wasn't there for that conversation, but I heard about it later in pieces from people who were. I heard that my mother went pale reading the pawn shop receipt. I heard my father didn't say a word for almost 10 full minutes. I heard that when the detective explained the IP metadata on the wire transfers, my mother asked, in a small voice nobody recognized, whether there had been a mistake. There hadn't been a mistake. There had only been 20 years of choosing the easier story over the truthful one. Brianna was arrested 2 days later, not on the lawn of our childhood home with cameras and a sobbing performance, but quietly, in the parking lot of her office, with far less ceremony than she'd given me. The charges were larger than the $89,000 from the trust. Once investigators started pulling threads, they found 2 other accounts she'd been slowly draining for years. Money she'd convinced our aging grandmother to help manage before she passed. Money nobody had ever thought to question because Brianna had always been the trustworthy one. My parents called me 3 days after that. My mother cried on the phone for almost an hour, the kind of crying that comes from finally understanding something you spent decades refusing to see. My father said less, but he showed up at my apartment a week later with a box of my old school photos he'd kept, the kind of gesture that meant more coming from him than any speech could have. I won't pretend everything is repaired. 20 years of being the unstable one, the dramatic one, the one nobody quite believed, doesn't dissolve because the truth finally came out. But for the first time in my life, when I tell my parents something happened, they don't ask Brianna for a second opinion first. The charges against me were dropped before the week was out, the record cleared, an official letter mailed to my apartment that I keep in the same fireproof box, right next to the folder that started it all. I think about that 12-year-old version of me sometimes, sitting on her bedroom floor, tucking a photograph behind a stack of textbooks because some instinct told her she'd need it one day. She didn't know it would take 20 years. She just knew not to throw it away. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for someone to finally believe them. I learned the hard way that belief isn't something you wait for. It's something you document, piece by piece, until the truth becomes impossible to deny. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the one nobody believed until the proof was sitting right in front of them, hit that subscribe button and stay close. There are more stories like mine waiting for you. Real ones, raw ones, the kind that remind you the truth always finds its way out eventually. Subscribe now, because the next story might be the one that feels like it was written about you.